The cabin in the woods. Emma walked on the dirt path. The sun was shining through the trees, and the air smelled fresh. She could hear birds singing and the sound of water nearby. The forest was quiet and peaceful. Big green leaves hung from the branches, and small flowers grew along the sides of the path. Emma carried a backpack. Inside, she had water, some snacks, and a flashlight. She wore strong boots for walking because the ground was soft in some places and full of little stones in others. She had been walking for hours, and her legs felt tired, but she was happy to be outside. Her grandfather had told her about a little cabin hidden in the woods. He had said it was a safe and quiet place, far from the noise of the world. Emma always wanted to find it. Today, she finally decided to look for it. After a long walk, Emma saw something ahead. The trees started to grow farther apart, and the path opened into a grassy area. In the middle of the grass stood a small wooden house, the cabin. Emma smiled. "I found it," she said softly. The cabin was small, with dark brown wood and a roof that sloped down. There was a little chimney on top, and smoke was rising from it. Emma stopped. Smoke? That meant someone might be inside. She walked closer. The windows were small squares with glass that looked old. Vines climbed up one side of the cabin, their green leaves covering the wood. A few wildflowers grew near the cabin, yellow ones, white ones, and even tiny purple ones. The cabin looked quiet and safe. Emma felt her shoulders relax. She reached for the door and pushed it open. The door creaked as it opened. Inside the cabin was simple but nice. There was a fireplace made of stone in one corner. A small table with 2 wooden chairs sat in the middle of the room. On the other side of the cabin was a bed with a colorful quilt on top. Sunlight came through the window and lit up the space. Emma put her backpack on the table and looked around. The air smelled like wood and something sweet, like flowers. Everything in the cabin was clean. It looked like someone had been taking care of it. She saw a bookshelf near the fireplace. It had old books lined up neatly. Emma picked one up and opened it. The pages were full of pictures of trees, plants, and birds. She smiled and put the book back. On the table, she noticed a notebook. She opened it and saw writing inside. The handwriting was messy, with short sentences that didn't say much. One page said, "The forest is always watching." Another page said, "The stream feels different after it rains." Emma frowned. The notes were strange, but she thought maybe someone had just been keeping track of little things they noticed in the forest. Emma left the cabin and followed a small path behind it. She heard water running, and soon she found a stream. The water was clear, and little fish swam in it. Emma crouched down and put her hand in the stream. The water was cold, but it felt nice after her long walk. The stream was surrounded by tall green plants. A butterfly landed on one of the plants, and Emma watched it for a moment. She picked up a smooth rock from the edge of the water and turned it over in her hand. Sitting on a big rock by the stream, Emma felt calm. The sound of the water and the gentle breeze made her feel peaceful. The forest seemed full of life, but it also felt quiet and safe. When the sun began to set, Emma went back to the cabin. The sky turned orange and pink, and the clearing around the cabin looked golden in the light. She brought out a little lantern from her bag and lit it. Its warm glow filled the cabin as the daylight faded. Emma sat at the table and ate a sandwich she had packed. Outside, she could hear the soft sounds of the forest, crickets singing and the wind moving through the trees. The cabin felt cozy and safe, and Emma was happy she had come here. After eating, she lay down on the bed. The quilt was soft, and the pillow smelled like lavender. She closed her eyes, listening to the quiet of the forest. Soon, she drifted off to sleep. Emma woke up suddenly. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the lantern on the table. Something had woken her up. She lay still, listening. At first, she heard nothing. Then she noticed a soft sound coming from outside. It wasn't the wind or the crickets. It was something else, like leaves moving. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. Emma sat up in bed, her heart beating faster. She stood quietly and walked to the window. Looking out, she could see the clearing, lit up by the moon. Everything looked the same as before. The cabin was surrounded by tall trees, their shapes dark against the night sky. But the sound was still there. It came from the edge of the clearing where the trees stood closest together. Emma squinted, trying to see into the shadows. Was someone there? Emma wasn't sure what to do. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was nothing at all. But the sound didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like something or someone was moving around. She thought about staying inside. The cabin felt safe, and she didn't want to leave it. But her curiosity was strong. She grabbed her flashlight from her bag and stood by the door. Her hand rested on the handle, and she took a deep breath. Just take a quick look, she told herself. It's probably nothing. Slowly, she opened the door. Emma stood in the doorway, holding her flashlight tightly. The air outside was cold, and she shivered. The clearing looked quiet under the moonlight, but the sound from the edge of the trees hadn't stopped. It was soft, like something moving slowly through the grass or the leaves. She turned on her flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, showing the cabin's small yard. Nothing moved. Emma's heart was beating fast, but she stepped outside, her boots making small noises on the wooden steps. The sound was still there, coming from the trees. Emma pointed her flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. The trees stood tall and still, their dark shapes almost blending into the night sky. The beam of light didn't reach far enough to see anything clearly. Emma took a deep breath. "Hello," she called out. Her voice sounded shaky in the quiet night. There was no answer. The sound stopped for a moment, and the silence felt heavy. Then, after a few seconds, the noise started again. It was the same steady rustling, like someone or something was moving. Emma stepped further into the clearing, her flashlight pointing straight ahead. The grass was cool under her boots, and the air smelled fresh, with a hint of something she couldn't name. She moved slowly, her eyes fixed on the trees. The sound didn't get louder or quieter as she walked. It stayed the same, coming from the same spot. Emma felt her hands trembling, but she kept going. She was curious, even though a part of her wanted to turn back. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped. The trees stood like a wall in front of her, their branches tangled above, blocking most of the moonlight. She pointed her flashlight into the shadows. The beam of light lit up the nearest trunks and a few low bushes, but nothing moved. Emma's voice was quiet. "Is someone there?" The sound stopped again. Emma held her breath, listening. The forest felt so still it made her skin crawl. She thought maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal. She took a step closer to the trees, her flashlight sweeping back and forth. Just as she was about to turn around, she saw something. Two small points of light, like tiny reflections, deep in the shadows. They were low to the ground, almost at the level of her knees. Emma froze. "What is that?" she whispered. The points of light didn't move. They just stared at her, glowing faintly in the dark. Emma felt her heart pounding in her chest. Her flashlight beam shook slightly as she held it steady, trying to see what the lights belonged to. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Hello? Are you an animal?" The lights blinked, disappearing for a second, then reappeared. Emma gasped and stepped back, her boots crunching on the grass. Whatever it wasn't running away. It was watching her. She thought about turning around and going back to the cabin. But then she remembered the notebook on the table. Her grandfather had written about the forest, about how it seemed to notice things. Maybe this was part of what he had meant. Emma held her ground. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, hoping the thing would understand. The lights blinked again, but this time they moved. Slowly they rose higher, as if the creature were standing up. The flashlight beam caught the outline of something small and thin. It looked like a deer, but its legs were too long, and its body was too still. Its head tilted slightly, the glowing eyes fixed on Emma. Emma felt a chill run through her. She didn't know what this thing was, but she didn't want to stay and find out. She took a step back, then another, her flashlight still pointing at the creature. It didn't follow her, but its eyes stayed locked on hers. When she reached the middle of the clearing, she turned and ran. Her boots thudded softly against the ground as she hurried back to the cabin. She didn't look behind her, afraid of what she might see. Once she was inside, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her breathing was loud in the quiet room, and her hands shook as she turned off the flashlight. She leaned against the door, her chest rising and falling quickly. The cabin felt safe, but her heart wouldn't stop racing. She thought about the creature, its eyes, its long legs, the way it had stood so still. It didn't seem like it wanted to hurt her, but it didn't feel normal either. Emma lit the lantern on the table and sat down. The warm light filled the room, but the shadows in the corners seemed darker now. She couldn't stop thinking about the forest, about the way it had felt like something was watching her. Emma didn't sleep much that night. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every small noise made her flinch. The wind, the creak of the trees, the hoot of an owl. It all felt too close. When the sun finally rose, Emma sat up, her body tired and stiff. She looked out the window. The clearing was bright and calm, with sunlight streaming through the trees. The creature was gone, and the forest looked normal again. She opened the door and stepped outside. The cool morning air felt good against her skin. Birds were singing, and the sound of the stream reached her ears. It was hard to believe that anything strange had happened the night before. Emma walked to the edge of the clearing where she had seen the creature. There were no footprints, no sign that it had ever been there. She felt a mix of relief and confusion. Maybe I imagined it, she said to herself. But deep down she knew she hadn't. Back inside the cabin, Emma opened the notebook on the table. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the messy handwriting. One sentence stood out. The forest shows itself in its own time. Emma frowned. What did that mean? She thought about the glowing eyes, the strange way the creature had moved. Was the forest trying to show her something? She decided to stay another night. Maybe the forest had more to reveal. And maybe, just maybe, she would figure out what her grandfather had meant. Emma spent the morning sitting by the stream. The sunlight warmed her back, and the sound of the water made her feel calm. She wanted to forget about the strange things she had seen in the forest, but it stayed in her mind. Those glowing eyes, the way it stood so still, it didn't feel normal. She looked around the forest as she sat there. The trees seemed tall and quiet. The leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and little birds hopped from branch to branch. It was peaceful now, but Emma couldn't help feeling like the forest was hiding something. After eating lunch, Emma decided to explore more of the forest. She packed her flashlight, a snack, and a bottle of water in her backpack, just in case she stayed out longer than she planned. She started on a new path, one she hadn't seen the day before. It was narrow and covered in fallen leaves. Her boots made soft noises as she walked. The trees here were closer together, and their branches blocked most of the sunlight, making the path darker. Emma walked slowly, looking around. The forest felt different here, quieter, almost like it was holding its breath. She stopped and listened. She could still hear the stream in the distance, and the occasional chirp of a bird, but everything else was silent. She kept going, stepping carefully over roots and small rocks. The path led her deeper into the forest, where the trees grew even closer together. The air felt cooler, and shadows covered the ground. As Emma walked, she noticed something unusual on the trees. Some of their trunks had marks carved into the bark. The marks were simple, just lines and shapes, but they didn't look natural. Emma stopped and touched one of the marks. The lines were smooth, like someone had carved them carefully. She ran her fingers over them, trying to guess what they meant. Were they just scratches from animals, or had someone made them on purpose? She looked around. The markings were on several trees, not just one. They seemed to form a pattern, leading further down the path. Emma felt a little nervous, but her curiosity pushed her forward. The path ended at another clearing. This one was much smaller than the one where the cabin stood. The ground was covered in soft moss, and the air felt colder here. In the middle of the clearing stood a large stone. It was smooth and round, like it had been placed there by someone, not by nature. Emma walked closer to the stone. It had more carvings on it, similar to the ones she had seen on the trees. She bent down to look at them, her fingers tracing the lines. They were simple shapes, circles, triangles, and straight lines, but they felt meaningful, like they were trying to tell her something. She sat down on the moss and took out the notebook from her bag. She had brought it with her in case it gave her any clues. Flipping through the pages, she found another strange sentence. The stone is the heart. Emma frowned. The heart of what? She whispered to herself. The air in the clearing felt heavier the longer she stayed. Emma decided it was time to head back to the cabin. She stood up, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and started walking back along the narrow path. The forest felt different now. The air was colder, and the trees seemed taller, their branches blocking more of the sunlight. Emma quickened her pace, her boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. When she reached the cabin, the clearing around it looked warm and bright again. The sun was lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the grass. Emma let out a sigh of relief as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. As the evening grew darker, Emma lit her lantern and ate a simple dinner of bread and cheese. The cabin felt cozy and safe, but she couldn't stop thinking about the stone and the markings. What was the heart, and why did her grandfather's notebook talk about it? She sat at the table, turning the pages of the notebook. Most of the sentences didn't make sense. They were short and strange, like, the trees listen at night, the water remembers, the light is not always friendly. Emma shook her head. What were you trying to tell me, Grandpa? She said softly. As the sun set, the forest grew quiet again. Emma stood by the window, looking out at the clearing. The moon was bright, and the grass glowed softly under its light. Everything looked peaceful. She lay down on the bed and pulled the quilt over herself. The cabin was warm from the fire in the fireplace, and the soft crackling of the flames made her feel calm. Her eyes grew heavy, and soon she drifted off to sleep. Emma dreamed of the forest. She was walking along the path again, but this time it was darker. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching toward her like arms. She saw the stone in the clearing, glowing faintly. The markings on its surface shone with light, forming shapes she couldn't understand. In her dream, Emma reached out to touch the stone, but just before her fingers touched it, a loud sound echoed through the forest, a low, deep rumble like thunder. She turned around, but there was nothing there. The forest was empty, but it felt like something was watching her. Emma woke with a start. Her heart was pounding, and her forehead was damp with sweat. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. She sat up, her breathing fast. It was just a dream, she told herself. But it didn't feel like one. It felt real, too real. She rubbed her arms, trying to calm herself, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Emma lit the lantern again and sat at the table, staring at the notebook. The sentence, "The stone is the heart," seemed to glow in her mind. She knew she couldn't leave yet, not until she figured out what the forest was trying to tell her. Emma sat at the table, holding the notebook. The lantern on the table lit up the cabin with a warm glow, but she didn't feel calm. The dream about the stone and the strange forest wouldn't leave her mind. She read the sentence again, "The stone is the heart." Emma tapped her fingers on the table. What did it mean? She thought about the strange stone in the small clearing. It didn't look like it belonged there. The carvings on it were strange too. Maybe the forest was trying to show her something, just like the dream. Emma looked out the window. The forest was dark, and the moonlight lit up the clearing. She decided she needed to see the stone again. Maybe there was something she had missed. Emma grabbed her flashlight and put on her jacket. She slipped the notebook into her backpack, along with a bottle of water. The forest could be cold at night, and she wanted to be ready. When she stepped outside, the air felt cool against her skin. The clearing around the cabin was quiet. The grass looked silver under the light of the moon. Emma turned on her flashlight and pointed it at the narrow path that led to the stone. Her boots made soft sounds as she walked. The forest was silent, with no birds or wind. The trees stood tall and still, their branches heavy above her. Emma tried not to think about the strange creature she had seen the night before. She kept her eyes on the path, moving slowly. The deeper Emma walked into the forest, the more it felt strange. The air was colder here, and the light from the moon didn't reach the ground. Her flashlight lit the way, but the shadows around her seemed darker. Emma looked at the trees. Some of them had the same marks she had seen earlier. Carved lines and shapes covered the bark, but she still couldn't understand what they meant. They reminded her of the carvings on the stone. She stopped for a moment and touched one of the marks. It felt smooth and cool under her fingers. "Who made these?" she whispered. Her voice sounded loud in the quiet forest. Emma looked around. Nothing moved, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, like it was watching her. Finally, Emma reached the clearing with the stone. The moss on the ground was soft, and the stone stood in the middle, tall and round. Her flashlight lit it up, and she saw the carvings again. Circles, lines, and strange shapes that seemed to glow softly under the light. Emma stepped closer, her hands shaking a little. She set her flashlight down on the moss so it shined on the stone. She crouched and touched one of the carvings. It felt warm, like it was alive. As she ran her fingers over the lines, she noticed something new. Part of the stone had a small crack, just big enough to fit her fingers into. Emma hesitated. The crack looked deep, and she wasn't sure what would happen if she touched it. But curiosity won. She slid her fingers into the crack and felt something inside. It was small and smooth, and when she pulled it out, she saw it was a tiny object made of metal. It looked like a key. The key was simple, with no carvings or writing on it. Emma turned it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, and it felt cold, even though the stone had been warm. She picked up her flashlight and shined it around the clearing, looking for anything the key might belong to. But the clearing was empty, except for the stone. The trees around her stood like silent walls, their shadows stretching toward her. Emma put the key in her pocket. She didn't know what it was for, but she had a feeling it was important. She grabbed her flashlight and started walking back toward the cabin. The forest felt even quieter now, as if it were waiting for something. When Emma reached the clearing around the cabin, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The cabin looked warm and safe, its windows glowing with light from the lantern inside. She stepped inside and locked the door behind her. The warmth of the cabin felt good after the cold forest. Emma pulled the key out of her pocket and placed it on the table. It looked small and harmless, but she couldn't stop staring at it. "What are you for?" she whispered. She opened the notebook again, flipping through the pages. Her grandfather's notes were short and strange, but none of them mentioned a key. Emma sighed and leaned back in her chair. She felt tired, but she knew she wouldn't sleep. The forest, the stone, the key, everything felt like a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. Emma's eyes wandered around the cabin. She had explored most of it already, but there was one thing she hadn't looked at closely: the small drawer under the bookshelf. She stood up and walked over to it. The drawer was old and dusty, and it didn't have a handle. She pulled it open carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Emma picked it up and opened it. The paper was yellowed with age, and the writing on it was messy, like her grandfather's notes. It said, "The key will open what you need, but only when the forest is ready." Emma stared at the paper, her heart pounding. What did that mean? What was the key supposed to open? She folded the paper and put it in her pocket with the key. Sitting back down at the table, she felt more confused than ever. The forest was keeping secrets, and she didn't know if she wanted to find them. Emma sat at the table, staring at the key. It sat in the middle of the wooden surface, small and quiet, but it felt heavy in her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about the note she had found. The key will open what you need, but only when the forest is ready. What does that mean? Emma whispered to herself. Her voice sounded small in the quiet cabin. The forest felt strange, like it was hiding something. She knew the key was part of the answer, but she didn't know what to do next. The sky outside was clear, and the sun was bright. Emma decided to go back to the stone in the small clearing. She wanted to see if there was anything else she had missed. She slipped the key into her pocket, grabbed her backpack, and stepped outside. The morning air was cool, and the forest was full of soft sounds. Birds singing, the wind moving the leaves, and the bubbling stream nearby. It felt peaceful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She followed the narrow path through the trees. The forest seemed lighter now, with sunlight streaming through the branches. The carvings on the trees looked the same as before, lines, shapes, and circles. Emma ran her fingers over one as she passed. It felt smooth and old, like it had been there for years. When she reached the clearing, the stone stood tall in the middle, just as she had left it. The carvings on its surface looked the same, and the moss around it was soft and green. Emma walked up to the stone and placed her hand on it. It felt warm again, just like before. Emma crouched down and looked at the carvings more closely. She ran her fingers over the lines, tracing their patterns. Some of the shapes were circles, while others were triangles and stars. The carvings didn't seem random. They felt like they had a purpose, but Emma couldn't tell what it was. She pulled the key out of her pocket and held it up to the stone. It didn't match any of the carvings, and there wasn't a place to put it. Emma sighed. "What are you for?" she asked the key softly. She stood up and looked around the clearing. The trees formed a circle around the stone, their dark trunks rising like tall walls. The sunlight flickered through their branches, creating spots of light and shadow on the ground. As Emma turned to leave, something caught her eye. One of the trees near the edge of the clearing looked different. Its bark was smoother, and its trunk was wider than the others. Emma walked toward it, her heart beating faster. When she reached the tree, she saw what had caught her attention. There was a small crack in the trunk, just big enough for the key. Emma stared at it, her hand trembling as she pulled the key from her pocket. She hesitated. "Do I really want to do this?" she asked herself, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Slowly, she slid the key into the crack and turned it. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the bark shifted. A narrow door appeared in the trunk, opening slowly. Emma stepped back, her heart racing. The inside of the tree was dark, but she could see a faint glow coming from deep within. Emma grabbed her flashlight from her backpack and shined it into the tree. A narrow passage led down into the ground, its walls made of smooth wood that seemed to shimmer under the light. The glow at the bottom was soft and golden, like a hidden fire burning far away. She stepped inside the tree, ducking her head to fit through the small door. The air inside was cool and smelled like fresh earth. Her boots made soft sounds as she walked down the passage. The golden glow grew brighter with each step. The passage ended in a round room. The walls were made of smooth wood, and the ceiling rose high above her, curving like the inside of a dome. In the center of the room was a pool of water, its surface glowing with golden light. Emma knelt by the pool, staring into the glowing water. The light seemed to move, swirling gently like it was alive. She reached out and touched the surface. It was warm and smooth, and it felt like silk against her fingers. As she touched the water, images appeared in the light. She saw the forest, the cabin, and the stone in the clearing. The images shifted, showing her the carvings on the trees and the stone. Then she saw something new, another door hidden in the forest. Emma gasped and pulled her hand back. The images disappeared, and the water returned to its soft golden glow. "Another door?" she whispered. "Where?" She looked around the room, hoping for a clue. The walls were smooth and empty, and the passage behind her was the only way out. Emma stood and stared at the pool. "What are you trying to show me?" she asked, but the water didn't answer. Emma climbed back up the passage and stepped out of the tree. The forest felt different now, like it was alive and waiting for her. The sunlight was brighter, and the air smelled fresher. Emma slipped the key back into her pocket and started walking. She didn't know where to look for the new door, but something pulled her deeper into the forest. The path under her feet was soft with leaves, and the trees around her stood tall and quiet. The carvings on their trunks seemed to glow faintly in the sunlight, guiding her forward. After a while, Emma saw something in the distance. It was another clearing, smaller than the one with the stone. In the middle of the clearing stood a wooden door, tall and wide, with carvings just like the ones on the trees. Emma stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the door. It stood alone, with no walls or frame to hold it. The carvings on its surface were bright and sharp, as if someone had just made them. Emma felt a mix of fear and excitement as she walked closer. She reached out and touched the door. It felt warm like the stone and the pool of water. The carvings seemed to hum softly under her fingers, sending a vibration through her hand. Emma pulled the key from her pocket. The lock on the door was small and round, and the key fit perfectly. She took a deep breath and turned it. The door opened slowly, creaking as it moved. Bright light spilled through the opening, and Emma shielded her eyes. She couldn't see what was on the other side, but the air that came through felt warm and alive, filled with the scent of flowers and fresh grass. Emma stepped through the door, her heart pounding. Whatever lay beyond, she knew it would change everything. Emma stepped through the door. Bright light surrounded her. She held up her hand to cover her eyes because the glow was too strong. Slowly, the light became softer, and she could see again. She was in a new forest, but it looked very different from the one near the cabin. The trees here were golden, their leaves shining like they were made of light. The ground was soft and green, covered in moss and little glowing plants. The air smelled sweet like flowers, and it felt warm and peaceful. Emma walked forward, looking around. Everything was quiet. The trees seemed alive, but they didn't make any sound. Their branches didn't move, and the air was still. Emma felt small in this place. It was beautiful, but it also felt strange, like she wasn't supposed to be here. As she walked, something moved ahead. Emma stopped. It was a shadow, small and quick, slipping between the trees. She couldn't see it clearly, but it was there. "Hello?" Emma called softly. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet forest. The shadow didn't answer. It moved again, and Emma decided to follow it. Emma stepped carefully over the mossy ground, following the shadow. It moved quickly, but it didn't seem to run away. Every time Emma thought she had lost it, it appeared again, just ahead of her. The forest around her was glowing softly. The golden leaves gave off a gentle light, and the little plants on the ground looked like stars. Emma's heart was beating fast. She didn't know where the shadow was leading her, but she felt like she had to keep going. After a while, Emma came to a large, clear lake. The water didn't move at all, and it was so shiny it looked like glass. Tiny lights floated above the surface, glowing softly in the air. Emma stopped at the edge of the lake and stared. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The light seemed to dance, and the golden trees reflected on the still water. The shadow appeared again, but this time it changed. Slowly it took shape, becoming a small animal, a golden fox with bright, glowing eyes. Emma froze watching it. The fox didn't look dangerous. It was small and calm, standing by the edge of the water. The fox turned to look at her, then dipped its paw into the lake. When the fox touched the lake, ripples spread across the water. The floating lights swirled in circles, and the water started to show pictures. Emma stepped closer and looked into the glowing surface. In the lake, she saw the forest near the cabin. She saw the tall trees, the stone with carvings, and the small pool of light she had found earlier. Then the images changed. Emma saw something new, a golden tree standing alone in another clearing. The fox lifted its paw, and the pictures in the water disappeared. The lake became still again, and the lights floated back into the air. The fox looked at Emma one last time, then turned and ran into the forest. Emma stood by the lake, her mind racing. The lake had shown her the golden tree, but she didn't know where to find it. She felt like the tree was important, like it was the reason she had come here. She turned away from the lake and followed the direction the fox had gone. The forest grew quieter as she walked. The trees seemed taller, and the golden light around her became brighter. Emma didn't know where she was going, but she felt like the forest was guiding her. After a long walk, Emma saw it. The golden tree stood in the middle of a big open space. Its trunk was thick and smooth, and its branches stretched out high above her. The golden leaves on the tree glowed softly, lighting up the clearing. Emma stepped into the clearing, staring at the tree. It felt powerful, almost alive. She walked closer and saw carvings on the tree's trunk. They looked like the carvings on the stone in the trees near the cabin. She reached out and touched the carvings. The tree felt warm under her hand, and her fingers tingled slightly. In the middle of the trunk was a small hole, just the right size for the key. Emma pulled the key from her pocket. She held it tightly, feeling nervous but also curious. Slowly, she slid the key into the hole and turned it. The tree shook gently, and a door appeared in its trunk. The door opened slowly, and golden light poured out. The light was brighter than anything Emma had ever seen. She covered her eyes with her hand and stepped closer. Inside the tree, everything was glowing. Shapes moved in the light, animals, plants, and even people. Emma couldn't explain it, but it felt like the forest was alive, like she was seeing its heart. A voice spoke in her mind. It was soft and clear. "You have opened the heart. The forest will remember you." Emma felt warm all over, as if the light itself had touched her. She didn't fully understand what the voice meant, but she knew this was important. The forest had shared its secret with her, and she felt connected to it in a way she never had before. The door in the tree slowly closed, and the light faded. The tree stood still, glowing softly, as if it was resting now. Emma stood in the clearing for a moment, holding the key in her hand. Finally, she turned and started walking back. The forest was quiet, and the golden light around her felt peaceful. When she reached the wooden door she had entered through, it opened for her without the key. Emma stepped through and found herself back in the familiar forest near the cabin. The trees there looked the same, but something about them felt stronger, more alive. Emma smiled. The forest had shared its secret, and she knew she would never forget it. Emma stood in the forest near the cabin. The trees felt different now. They seemed taller, stronger, and quieter. The sunlight came through the leaves, lighting up the mossy ground. Everything looked the same, but Emma felt it wasn't. The forest had shared its secret, and she felt it watching her in a calm, peaceful way. She slipped the key into her pocket. She didn't know if she would need it again, but it felt important to keep it. Slowly, she walked back toward the cabin, her boots crunching softly on the path. When Emma reached the cabin, the clearing felt warm and safe. The grass moved gently in the breeze, and the wildflowers swayed. The cabin looked exactly as it had when she first saw it, small, quiet, and welcoming. She stepped inside and set her backpack on the table. The air inside smelled like wood and something sweet, like flowers. The fire in the fireplace had burned out, but the room was still warm. Emma lit the lantern and sat at the table, staring at the notebook. She turned to the last page she had read, where it said, "The stone is the heart." Now she understood. The stone, the carvings, and the pool of light were all connected. They were part of the forest, part of something much bigger. Emma picked up a pen from the table. She opened the notebook to a blank page and began to write. Her words were simple, just like her grandfather's. She wrote about the golden forest, the glowing lake, and the golden tree. She wrote about the voice she had heard and how the forest had shared its secret. She didn't know if anyone would ever read her notes, but it felt right to write them down. The forest had trusted her with its secret, and she wanted to remember it. As the sun set, the forest grew quieter. The light from the window turned golden, and shadows stretched across the room. Emma sat outside on the cabin steps, watching the clearing. The grass shone softly in the fading light, and the trees stood still, their leaves glowing faintly in the twilight. She felt calm now, like the forest had accepted her. She didn't feel scared or unsure anymore. She knew she belonged here, at least for a little while. Emma woke up early the next day. The sky outside was bright and the forest was full of sounds, birds singing, the stream bubbling, and leaves rustling gently in the breeze. She packed her things, folding the notebook carefully and placing it in her bag. She slipped the key into her pocket, knowing she couldn't leave it behind. As she stepped outside, the forest seemed to greet her. The sunlight streamed through the trees, lighting up the path. The cabin stood quietly behind her, as if it was saying goodbye. Emma followed the trail through the forest, heading back the way she had come days ago. The trees around her seemed full of life, and she noticed new things. Tiny flowers blooming on the ground, small birds hopping from branch to branch. The forest didn't feel like just a place anymore. It felt like a friend. When she reached the edge of the forest, she turned to look back one last time. The trees stood tall and golden in the sunlight. She smiled, knowing the forest would always be there, watching and waiting. As Emma walked away, she felt different. She didn't know if she would ever return to the cabin or the forest, but she knew she would never forget it. The golden tree, the glowing lake, the quiet fox, all of it had changed her. She felt lighter, calmer, and more connected to the world around her. The forest had shared its secret, and Emma would carry it with her wherever she went.